So I'm going to talk you through a couple of slides today. As presenter MC mentioned, my name is Mary DiBenedetto. I'm a member of the INDOPACOM Directorate for Intelligence, and kind of what we look at is the security environment and the threats. And we've talked a lot about challenges and threats and the increasing kind of complex security environment. I want to give you a little more detail from an intelligence perspective of what that means, what that looks like, and especially as it relates to Guam. So I'm going to go through a couple of things today, and then I'll turn it over to Colonel Weary for the posture piece of that. So if I go to the next slide, please. So just to start off, this slide depicts INDOPACOM's area of responsibility. As can be noted in the corner boxes, as I'm sure most of you are very familiar with who live in the area and live in the Pacific, the demographics and characteristics of the region are incredibly diverse. This creates a complex and evolving security environment that our leaders need to navigate and be able to react to in a critical contingency. I highlight this point because while most of what I'm going to talk to you about today is our primary security challenge of China, there are other actors and other developments in the region that can and do cause the deterioration of the security environment and can draw U.S. attention and potentially U.S. resources, specifically military resources. So in the center bottom box, you can see that we focus on 5 key challenges. I'll talk individually about the state actors and their most concerning, and most concerningly, their increasing cooperation. But trans-regional issues of natural disasters and violent extremism continue to also warrant significant attention. Just this year, we've seen destructive earthquakes, monsoons, typhoons, and wildfires in the region. And not to mention, a terrorist attack in Palgram led to armed conflict between 2 nuclear-armed nations of India and Pakistan. So as you can see, those issues continue to be something that we need to be aware of from a security perspective and a threat perspective to our forces. But let me give you 2 themes for this brief as we go through. Number 1, the security environment in the Pacific is only getting more complex and tenuous. And number 2, our strategic competitors, our adversaries, strengthening relations are going to exacerbate the region's security challenges. Next slide, please. So I'll start with North Korea. Pyongyang has continued unabated in its aggressive and destabilizing rhetoric and actions despite administration changes in both the United States and South Korea. Kim Jong-un is pressing forward in developing his strategic missile capabilities to gain a capability credible to threaten the United States homeland and our allies. The DPRK's missile program has improved in both technical capacity and tactical employment, as you can see by some of the significant launches in the last year. Notably, DPRK is testing and developing multiple classes of ballistic missile capability beyond just their ICBM capabilities, to include its intermediate range ballistic missile. This is the same quote-unquote Guam killer missile system that KJU threatened to launch against Guam back in 2017. As you can see, they launched a test just back in January of this year. North Korea is being emboldened in this program by what is likely the most concerning security development in the region over the last 2 years. What I'm speaking about is the strengthening military partnership between Russia and the DPRK. In return for thousands of troops, millions of rounds of artillery, and well over 100 ballistic missiles, DPRK is likely receiving food, fuel, and dual-use technologies, which is bolstering its military development. Not to mention its troops in Russia are receiving critical lessons learned and experience in a modern battlefield, something DPRK has sorely lacked and is looking for potential future development of its force. This relationship has showed no signs of slowing down despite Moscow's successes on the battlefield in Ukraine. As we can see from highlighted in the recent Victory Day parade in Beijing, KJU's consistent meetings with senior Russian officials, this relationship is not slowing down and is going to get worse probably in the future. Next slide, please. Which brings me to Russia. Russia is not just a European problem. Russia is also a Pacific problem. That's something we like to highlight from INDOPACOM. Specifically, despite Russia's significant military focus on the war in Ukraine, Moscow has continued to modernize and increase its military capacity in the Pacific, primarily in the maritime domain. Likely as part of Moscow's efforts to message military strength and challenge U.S. and allies' freedom of movement in the Pacific, Russia has continued to assign its most capable surface and subsurface assets with both conventional and nuclear strike capability to the Pacific Fleet. Several of these assets have their most capable land attack missile capabilities. longer caliber capable missile systems which can reach distant ranges. In the air domain, we continue to see consistent Russian strategic bomber patrols entering into the Alaska Air Defense Identification Zone. Even despite Operation Spiderweb, which was Ukraine's deep strategic strike by UAVs to target Russian strategic bombers, we just saw Russia conduct their strategic bomber patrol back in July of this year towards the Alaskan ADIZ, which highlights that their continued capability is going on despite these setbacks. We've also seen Russia increase its combined patrols with China. In July 2024, they conducted their first combined patrol near Alaska, and this past November, China included its nuclear-capable bomber variant in the combined patrol. Just last month, Russia and China completed a combined maritime surface patrol, which was followed by their first ever combined submarine patrol. While Russia and China heavily message that their partnership is unbreakable and that these combined activities showcase their strong relationship, we highlight that these operations have not shown any significant development or integration of their forces, which highlights that messaging is the key goal for these types of activities. Beyond that, Russia remains a prolific cyber threat actor, targeting US military, civilian, and infrastructure networks regularly. We see Russia as continuing this trend as the years continue in order to complicate US military activities, not just in the Pacific, but worldwide. Next slide, please. Which brings me to China, and this is what I'll talk about for the rest of my time here. This is our pacing challenge. As has been discussed throughout this morning, you know that China challenged us in the economic space, in the information space, in the diplomatic space, but I'm going to focus primarily on how China challenged us in the military space. To understand how PRC challenges us and the ongoing modernization of the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, we must first look at Beijing's ultimate strategic objectives. Obviously, as the People's Liberation Army is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party, the PLA's #1 goal is to always ensure the party remains in power. That's a key thing to remember. The PLA is not like us. They are not the state's military. They are not there to defend China. They're there to defend the Chinese Communist Party. However, having achieved that goal pretty well over the last couple of decades, it's the next two objectives that you see highlighted here that have driven PLA's planning more recently. First, PLA's goal is to secure what Beijing views as its core sovereign territory. So what's a core sovereign territory? A core sovereign territory is every area China says it's theirs by drawing a new line on a map, such as the South China Sea, East China Sea, Indian border regions, and Taiwan. As we will see discussed in a later slide, the PLA is overwhelmingly trained to one specific mission aligned with this objective, and that's a military force unification with Taiwan, indicating that unifying with Taiwan as priority #1 for the PRC. However, focusing on that second objective I have highlighted, it's to achieve military preponderance to keep US and allies from interfering in that previous objective I just talked about. So in other words, keeping us out of the fight. And that's what we see the strategic threat environment here in Guam. You might know this strategy better as counter-intervention, because that's what we'll call it generally in the command. This is the capability that PLA has sought to achieve through developing extensive missile ranges, longer range capacity in their maritime and air domains, and through extensive military rehearsals. Next slide, please. So this is a busy slide, but I'll walk you through it a little bit. Depicted here, you have the 4 quadrants that show elements of the PLA development to achieve those 2 objectives I talk about. Starting in the upper left, you can see that much has been said about the growth of PLA's systems and capabilities over the past 25 years. And while they have progressed significantly in developing and fielding modern warfighting systems since 1999, it really accelerated in 2020, where we see this capacity start to rocket, no pun intended. Why 2020? This is after Chairman Xi advanced PLA's goal to fully modernize from 2035 to 2027, as Admiral Paparo talked to you about earlier. It was also the re-election of Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan, which PRC likely viewed as Taiwan moving further away from political means to force unification. The PLA's focus and development has been systems which provide the PLA longer range capabilities in which it can project power into the region, as well as to threaten its neighbors and challenge the US ability to operate within the region. Note the significant expansion of ballistic missile programs and fighters. This highlights that near-term first and second island chain capacity that it is building out. While the PLA has and is building a modern military, it's not a global military. It's a regional military focused on regional issues. So what do I mean by that? So if you go to the bottom left of the slide, PLA forces overwhelmingly operate this large military they've built in one area, and that's the Pacific, here. They don't deploy it anywhere else in the world. They keep this modern military that's very overstaffed here in the Pacific because that's their focus. On the right side of the slide, you can see how the PLA has increasingly utilized this new large military around Taiwan. Regular military pressure activities around Taiwan continue to intensify as the PLA aims to message Taiwan to capitulate to Beijing's rule, while the bottom right shows that PLA combat rehearsals are laser-focused on tasks and objectives associated with Taiwan invasion and counter-intervention. And we highlight it's also that 2020 timeline when we see that military pressure campaign around Taiwan really start to accelerate, consistently and specifically. Next slide, please. So I bring up this slide to highlight that while Taiwan is likely the most tenuous, most near-term threat we see is for contingency with PRC, they are using this military to pressure on all sides. We see them increasing their aggressiveness in the South China Sea. You might have seen some of those Chinese Coast Guard collisions with Philippine Coast Guard or with their own boats while chasing Philippine Coast Guard. In the East China Sea and the Senkaku Islands, Indian border regions, the intent is to build that military to pressure their neighbors and force capitulation on PRC's terms. Next slide, please. However, staying on the topic of PLA exercises, which again, we call rehearsals because that's what they're effectively doing. What we've seen is that the last few years is that the PLA continues to expand the scope and depth of its regular service and joint level exercises to focus on Taiwan blockade and invasion scenarios. From a command perspective, because of the depth and complexity of these exercises, you can see that there's pretty significant planning as to the different phases of an invasion operation. And on the slide, you can see some of the areas that we regularly see PLA rehearsing. Things like amphibious lift capabilities, civil military fusion, because they don't have actually the military lift capacity to put all those folks on the island. There we see them using civilian ro-ros, civilian cargo capacity. Their civilian military infrastructure is pretty well linked, and you can see it in their training. And then we see things like airborne air assault landings and urban combat. Notably, China's not very secret about these activities, which is why I can talk to you at the unclassified level. These things are well covered by media, as you can see by some of the snippets. Why? Because a key piece of PRC's strategy is messaging, right? The thought of win without fighting. China would prefer to force capitulation without firing a shot, and this public messaging to Taiwan, as well as the US and allies, is intended to showcase PLA's capabilities in the same way its consistent pressure campaign around Taiwan pushes a narrative that the PLA is ready to invade and succeed. In fact, the top right photo, if you look there, that's a side-by-side shot of an urban military training mock-up, which is on the right, and then the Taiwan Presidential Palace on the left. Notice the similarities. In fact, you can probably go on Google Maps today and look up this training site in Western China, and if you overlay it with a map of Taipei, you'd notice that the road networks match, despite the fact China may be saying it's not training to anything specific or any enemy specific. Next slide, please. That means the same for counter-intervention, that second objective we talked about. Along those same lines, we see PLA regularly rehearse the counter-intervention tasks and objectives such as ground, maritime, and airstrike missions, air-to-air combat, and sea and air lines of communication disruption. As mentioned previously, these exercises also come with significant messaging component. And I think some of you are aware of the PLA video depicting a strike on Guam several years ago. That's intentional. This is compounded by PLA's fielding of its quote-unquote Guam killer missile, a moniker which they put in their own press. This is despite the fact that PRC has also stated publicly it's not training against any country in particular. This message is undercut when we see things like missile target mock-ups that resemble US maritime assets in the western deserts of China. This type of training has increasingly become more complex and bigger in scope each year as we approach Xi's Be Ready By date of 2027. And we see China, specifically the PLA, working each year to build larger scope and larger scale of these exercises to be ready by that date. And we'll talk about that date in a second. Next slide, please. So I highlight this slide as notional. But what does this mean for Guam? Based on our understanding of PLA doctrine and training and messaging, if PLA were to use military to force unification with Taiwan or another disputed area, the PLA would look to immediately and definitively dissuade the US and allies from intervening in its actions. How it would look to do this is by using a range of options to undermine US resolve and power projection capabilities, but while attempting to limit escalation. I emphasize that this is only representative of an approach that PRC could take against Guam. Excuse me. Remember, the goal is to keep the US out of the fight, not conduct a Pearl Harbor moment that the US would steal our resolve. Understand that China has studied military history. A Pearl Harbor moment only steals us to go full force. The intention is to limit escalation and force us out of the fight by a very incremental and messaged strategy, as you can kind of see here. Early on in a contingency, PLA would look to more reversible, non-kinetic effects to prevent the US from effectively operating out of Guam. This would equate to extensive cyber attacks very early on, targeting military and civilian communications, logistics, power, water, other infrastructure. A lot of the cyber activity would probably even occur preceding PRC initiation of hostilities, as they likely would assume that the US would intervene in any contingency. If and when the US would continue to move forces to intervene in a contingency in the Western Pacific, we'd likely see them escalate in the space domain to undermine our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, as well as our targeting capabilities. Should PLA then decide to move to more kinetic targeting of Guam with conventional forces, targeting would probably first focus on combat support sites, such as fuel and logistics facilities, communications facilities, as again, the intention is to stop this from being a place where we can project power and not pull us directly into the fight. However, PLA would seek to maintain standoff and focus their use of IRBMs before using their other capabilities like long-range bomber strike or maritime strike. Nuclear options would be a last resort, though we're likely to see messaging early on from the PLA on that front because a key part of this is messaging. As you can see, throughout the entire scope, operations in the information domain are going to become pretty constant. PRC would seek to strongly message what it was doing the entire time and operate in the information space to undermine US credibility, break up partnerships, and ensure that we do not come into that fight. Next slide, please. And I know we talked a little earlier about the 2027 timeline. I'll talk to you a little bit more in detail. Amr Papar already spoke much more eloquently than I can about it, but I'll give you a little more detail and depth of what we mean by the 2027, the quote-unquote Davidson window. So yes, that is the date that Xi told his military be ready by. So what does that mean? What does be ready by? So if you look at the graph, and you can see the PRC's perception of its risk to forces. PRC learned a lot from the war in Ukraine. It didn't learn the key thing of don't invade another sovereign nation. What it learned is don't do it poorly. And if you're going to do it fast and have little risk as possible. And so what they're doing with their military, why we see this extensive training, is everything that they can do to buy down that risk, to get to 2027. So if Chairman Xi wants to make that decision by 2027, it's in his tool bag to be able to make that decision. This does not mean he can't choose to invade earlier, but he wants to be ready by then. Also, it's a window. It is not an open-ended, China's now always going to be ready to invade. Chairman Xi understands that, right, that risk window will go back up the longer he waits. We also highlight, right, 2027 is the beginning of what we assume would be Xi's fourth term. He has a 5-year term. Likely he doesn't want to wait till the end of a term when he has to deal with internal political dynamics to conduct an operation. Not to mention China has things like economic challenges, demographics challenges, US military modernization, Taiwan military modernization, it has to think about. So that risk window doesn't stay low forever. It starts to tick back up the longer Xi waits. So that's why we call it a very dangerous window. It's a time when it's the lowest risk for PRC. So a lot of when we talk about deterrence, this is the intent of deterrence is to keep moving that risk window to the right and keep making Xi understand that the risk is too great to your forces. It will not succeed. You're not going to be able to do this. And with that, I'll turn it over to Colonel Weary for the posture piece.
Thanks, Mario. Governor Guerrero, distinguished attendees, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Colonel Chris Weary, and I am the chief of many things at INDOPACOM, lots of titles, lots of jobs in the jobs jar. The most interesting point to all of that is that because of that, I travel with Admiral Paparo quite frequently throughout the world, actually. I attend things on the spectrum from something like this all the way through congressional testimony. And in that experience, what I learned is what does it truly mean to enforce strategy across a large swath of the world? So I thought what I'd talk to you today about is, you've heard the threats. Mario just laid out kind of a grim picture, perhaps, as to how you take the information and look at the slides, and that's in the unclassified manner. You've heard the governor this morning, you've heard Admiral Paparo, heard their commitment from the governor and the admiral as to the defense of the homeland, the need for a force posture that gets after a credible force in the Western Pacific. So what are we doing about it? That's the real question. You know, that's the question I always get. So what is the strategy in Indo-Pacific Command? What are you doing in this part of the world for not only U.S. territories and possessions, but to set the conditions for a successful transition in support of any crisis or conflict that could arise in the Indo-Pacific? You know, one thing that's often lost about the Indo-Pacific is the uniqueness of it compared to other parts of the world. Specifically, the United States has mutual defense treaties with 5 different nations in this part of the world: Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, Kingdom of Thailand, Republic of Korea, and Japan. Those nations all have specific mutual defense treaties with us, which would mean that in any specific contingency or crisis for one of those countries, unrelated to the big topic that people like to always talk about, which is China, we would be compelled to determine how we would protect them or conduct operations with them in support of the crisis they were facing. And when you think about it that way, it requires that we do have a robust force posture across the Indo-Pacific, a large part of this earth. In fact, 54% of the world is overwatched by the United States Indo-Pacific Command. And as Admiral Paparo says, from polar bears to penguins and Bollywood to Hollywood. So let's go to the next slide. And so how do we do that? You know, this is a chart, and in the top left there, you can see the mission of United States Indo-Pacific Command. But what I would highlight to you there is at the bottom of the mission statement: defend the homeland, deter strategic attack, counter aggression, protect U.S. interests, and enhance U.S. alliance and partnerships. You know, for the naysayers that want to challenge me usually about this audacious force posture that we're aspiring to, is it somewhat offensive oriented? Aren't you oriented on going to war? It's not about that. It's about what it says in the mission statement. And frankly, we are so serious about the defense of the homeland. We've established a joint task force, Micronesia, which is there in the bottom right there. You can see in the purple box there, you know, Admiral Askey is the current commander. And that's how serious we are about our U.S. territories and possessions here in what we call the second island chain. We have to set the conditions so that they are adequately protected, adequately resilient, and prepared for any crisis or contingency that may befall this part of the U.S. Territory and possession footprint overall. So if we go to the next slide, and these are, next slide, please. So focus areas. In the top left there in green, you'll see essentials to Guam, essentials for Guam and our presence here, to protect the joint force, operate in a contested space, It goes without saying that if there was crisis or conflict with a major adversary in this region, this U.S. territories and possessions, you could assume would most likely be a target. So we have to be able to operate in that contested space. Active campaigning, what does that mean? As you know, multitude of U.S. vessels come in and out of Guam, submarines, aircraft, and they're all conducting operations activities throughout the region on a day in and day out basis, all to be credible forces forward in the area of operations to show our adversaries our ability to conduct operations forward. And then the last point there, critical logistics node. It goes without saying, it's quite far from California to Guam, and Guam into the first island chain or towards Taiwan. It's very far. And the further we have logistics forward, capabilities forward, it reduces our ability, or it increases our ability to conduct operations in support of our allies and partners in the region. The second thing I'd call out there is the quote in the bottom left. And that's one of those quotes I picked out of an engagement that Admiral Paparo had. And that was with the Senate Armed Services Committee. And I think that sums it up there. Like the Guam defense system, to bolster deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. And one thing I talked to him about this morning is he says, every chance you get today or during the Guam Defense Forum to highlight, it's not necessarily about setting conditions for offensive operations that we inevitably think are going to happen. And it's not about that. It is about establishing a credible defense package, a force posture that folks can understand is looking after our best interests, which is the homeland, Guam being part of it, the Marianas Islands and so forth being part of it, in the event that we did have to transition to some kind of crisis or conflict unknown at this point, at some point in the future. The third point I'd call out there are the orange boxes, and that's part of our overall continued strategy to increase our force posture forward in the area of responsibility. And that ranges from Southeast Asia through Oceania to our U.S. territories and possessions. And you can read what it says there in the boxes. The last point I'd call out is there in the top right. The second island chain is clearly way closer than mainland United States. And if you think back to the time before the rise of the contemporary Chinese threat, the North Koreans at this point are more capable than they've ever been. The Russians have increased their Pacific fleet in a way that we have not seen in recent years. So when it's all said and done, just 20 years ago, North Korea couldn't range very far with their missiles. Maybe they could reach to Japan. The Russian Federation had a Pacific fleet that was not as capable. They didn't have the advanced submarines that they now have in the Pacific that could, go all the way to the coast of the United States, somewhat undetected. And the Chinese, going back to Mario's slides or the intelligence slides, did not have clearly the capabilities they have now. They had, basic aircraft, basic Navy. And so if you put that all together and advance to where we are now in history, you have a Russian Federation force operating in the North Pacific and all the way out into the Pacific with advanced submarines that can range all the way to the mainland United States. You have ever-increasing North Korean missile capability that continues to expand their range now as far as Hawaii, and at some point they'll shoot for the western coast of the United States. And now you have a People's Liberation Army and a Chinese military that's increased their capabilities from essentially not being able to range Taiwan to now being able to reach not only Hawaii, but eventually mainland United States as well. An ever-expansive Navy that's now venturing outside the first island chain into the second island chain, and at some point they'll go further towards the mainland United States. All of that together is without us probing them saying, why don't you come out and play in the big blue? It's them doing that as part of their statecraft. It only makes sense that we would have to expand and ensure that our force posture matured from what it was in the height of the Cold War which was essentially, it was Northeast Asia specific. So after Vietnam, and besides Vietnam, our posture in the Pacific has been relatively unchanged since the end of World War II. Anybody that's been to Tinian and seen the breakwater wall there or other locations that we utilized in World War II would know that. So where was our posture? It was in Korea and Japan, and it's remained there in a hardened state ever since the end of the Korean War. It is only just now, based on the factors I've laid out before, that we've said, well, why don't we take a look at our posture and expand not only our investment in military construction so that we have multiple places to operate from to provide multiple problems for any adversary that wants to present themselves, and give ourselves the flexibility to not operate solely out of Northeast Asia or solely out of the mainland United States and fight the tyranny at distance. So if we go to the next slide, this is now reducing it further down towards Guam. A lot of, it's an eye chart, I understand that, but if you could zoom in with your eye right to the center of the chart there, and you can see Guam with its pie chart, and you can see the colors within it. Most of it's blue. In fact, more of it is blue than any other pie chart on the slide. What I'm trying to highlight there is that if you look at the legend in the bottom left, that's the design or acquisition phase. So like I said, the strategy was we needed to build out our posture overall to provide multiple problem sets for the adversary to consider and multiple places for us to operate from. And where did we start? We started in the American homeland with our territories and possessions, where we think we have the greatest access basing and overflight, and we'd be best and most likely always able to operate from during any contingency or crisis. And that's where we've started with the vast package of building military capabilities out here in the Pacific. Homeland defense, it's the core of our posture, and access basing and overflight is essential for any crisis or contingency that may ever need to be executed by the U.S. military. And that ranges for humanitarian assistance, disaster response because of a typhoon, or some low-level military operation that needs to be executed in support of a defense treaty ally somewhere in the region. The other piece I'd call out is the gray box there on the right. Military construction is traditionally a bureaucratic process that could take 7 to 8 years, sometimes longer. What is the sense right now in Washington is that perhaps we need to look at that bureaucracy and move faster. And I would tell you, in my engagement with leaders in Washington, both policymakers and elected officials, they understand the threat picture, they understand the threat briefing, things like Mario just briefed. They understand a guy like me talking about strategy and why it's imperative that we provide multiple problem sets for the adversaries. And so they want to help us, and thereby, those of us that are here on American territories and possessions, to move faster with military construction. They're looking to knock down bureaucratic walls, fund us more, robustly and consistently, and that's all part of the overall understanding of that 27 window. That 27 will most likely come and go, but nonetheless, it's the responsibility of the military leadership, specifically Admiral Paparo, to be fundamentally prepared for any contingency that could arise, not just in 27, but right now, and then moving forward into the future. So if we go to the next slide, it was mentioned earlier, Secretary Hegseth visited Guam. Early on in the administration, he decided to do his first overseas tour, and it was to Guam, Philippines, and Japan. His first stop was at our headquarters in Hawaii, at Admiral Paparo's headquarters in Oahu. And this is the exact slide I briefed to Secretary Hegseth in our conference room there. And because his first question was, so why am I going to Guam first? And I said, well, Mr. Secretary, it's all that stuff I said in the past couple of slides, but I said, that's the American homeland. It's essential to the defense of the joint force operating in the Pacific. And you need to understand the list of activities and operations that we would need to conduct out of Guam, not only in support of a contingency against China or the Taiwan Strait scenario, but against any of the adversaries that operate in and around the Pacific theater. And you can see that list on the left there. It's not all-inclusive of all the types of things that, and as to why Guam is important, but it's centrally and essential to our overall second island chain posture and our overall posture in the Indo-Pacific. Additional to my voiceover when I was talking to Secretary Hegseth was, I said we need to continue to have emphasis on increasing our posture in Guam, because outside of future potentials, which are listed there, there's also the very real reality of still recovering from Typhoon Marwar. Guam is a very robust port in the region. A lot of economics flows through Guam, as you all know. And so when you couple all that together, it made a very compelling state for him, or position for him to understand as he traveled into theater. The biggest thing he took away from it was, wow, that's just like Golden Dome, that Guam defense system thing. I said, yeah, you're onto it, Mr. Secretary. We need to expand the Golden Dome to be all-inclusive, to not just be mainland United States, and then we have something going on out here. That network of homeland defense capability starts all the way forward in North Korea and with space-based assets focused on the People's Republic of China, and continues all the way east, all the way back to mainland United States, passing through Guam. So we go to the next slide. Another eye chart. I'm not here to insult anybody's intelligence on the number of projects that are ongoing in Guam. The purpose of this slide is not to go into detailed line-by-line briefing of every project. I would defer to Joint Region Marianas, the Joint Task Force Commander, for their voiceover on where things are at and concerning all the different projects. The point of it is to highlight, we really are focused on critical infrastructure, homeland defense as per the purple box. The purple box in the top left there highlights all that. And I'd also call out there's 69 posture initiatives, multiple projects associated with each, $5.4 billion. This is number 2 in the overall Indo-Pacific area responsibility, only seconded to the Philippines. And that's just because the Philippines is a larger piece of geography and I have more places I could put stuff there. It's also very close to the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea and provides a lot of capabilities forward that I need to have forward to set the conditions if we need to go to crisis or contingency. The other interesting part about Guam, unlike anywhere else in the Pacific, and it's even more robust in Guam than it is in South Korea, every element of the U.S. Joint Force is represented on Guam in terms of capability and increasing capability as we move forward. So if we go to the last slide, these are some things that have been talked about today. I wanted to call them out because it's an example of how U.S. policymakers and elected officials are helping us enhance the tempo with which posture is increasing in the Indo-Pacific. You can read for yourself, but the top one there, the 2 H-2B visas extended to 29, that's an extension. That's helping us continue to have the labor force we need to get after this posture build out. The second bullet in there, application of dollar limitations for unspecified and minor military construction projects. That's, again, an increase. It was a lower amount, now it's a higher amount. The third bullet there, authority for Indo-Pacific posture, unspecified and minor military construction projects. Again, an increase to $30 million, an increase, and it's also an authority for us to execute through Indo-Pacific Command Headquarters as opposed to going through the services, which is how it's traditionally been done. And at the bottom there, in the works, renewal of the H-2B visa to go longer to 2035. This provides greater flexibility for leaders to manage the workforce in the out years. And the last bullet there, the ability to provide assistance to Guam, Marianas Islands, and COFA states to accelerate environmental reviews and establish defense sites. That's additive, and that's flexibility that we haven't had in the past. This is all for the purpose of maintaining tempo and providing greater security to Guam, which is part of the U.S. homeland. And with that, I think no more slides. We've had enough slides. And so I'm happy to address any questions for the last 5 minutes here or so.
My name is Marvi Kagurangan from the Pacific Island Times. So China's invasion of Taiwan is a contingent possibility in 2027. It may or may not happen around the time, but if it did, Guam will be entangled into the conflict. However, according to the record of decision for the Guam Missile Defense System, this project will not be completed until in 10 years, which means 2025. How will the Guam Missile Defense System be useful under construction if China attacks Taiwan in 2027?
Okay, thank you. If I understand the question is, there's an offset between anticipated delivery of overall completion of Guam Defense System and the window for when most likely there could be a vulnerability to a Chinese attack. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, hey, fair question. Absolutely fair question. A couple of things I would mention on it. The 27 window, and I'm not trying to defeat your question right off the front end. What I'm trying to tell you is there's no crystal ball, and we don't know that any form of attack happens in 27. What we do know is their military will be, continuing to increase and have it'll have mass. The most amount of numbers of vessels, ships, submarines, aircraft, soldiers, and so forth. We also do know that it coincides with their 100th anniversary of the regime. We do know that Xi Jinping has given, his leadership the requirement to be ready in 27. And so nobody would dispute any of that. The Guam Defense System, is part of that conversation for the protection of the U.S. homeland and territories here forward in the Pacific, island area. And most likely, there would still be shortcomings in 27 for the GDS system overall. Without dispelling a lot of classified information, there's other ways that military forces can protect, itself and protect, bodies of the earth and bodies of water and bodies of air. The planners, if we came to a crisis situation, would be, cognizant of what the capabilities were that were on hand at the time. And then we would work to offset that with other capabilities, understanding that our future design is not fully manifested. So, I hope I'm answering your question, but overall, it's understood that, we got a lot of work to do still here in Guam. There's several things that are still being developed. There's interoperability that needs to be, understood between the elements of the U.S. Joint Force here on Guam. And there's tests that still need to be run. But I don't think you should walk away with a fear that it's a zero-sum game, that if the GDS, in its fully operational capability is not established by 27, that you're at immense risk in Guam.
Colonel Weary, can
Please.
I add just one point to that as well? Part of the the posture and the forward posture is also, as we talked about, pursuing that deterrence towards China. So, when we talk about these systems like Guam Defense System or a forward posture, or I think folks saw the news, the typhoon in Japan, right? Some of these messaging is out there to help change PRC's perception of how ready they are and have them understand how ready we are, and hope to get them to recalculate their thoughts about timelines and when is a good opportunity. That's part of this as well. It's not just necessarily, having all the systems and everything ready in place, but also showing to China that we are getting systems in regular place to change their perception. So I think that helps us as well.
Can I ask just one more question? The recent Government Accountability Office report said that the Guam Missile Defense System is among the 58 priority projects for INDOPACOM that are underfunded under the current budget. Not underfunded, unfunded. Why is it unfunded?
Yeah, so concerning to the the specifics of the budgeting process. Again, I'm not a master at that side of it, but I do play in it a lot. What I would tell you is for fiscal year 26, because of the reconciliation package that Congress has passed, I don't think you would say there's unfunded requirements associated with the Guam defense system. I think we can say that the Guam defense system has the full backing of the Congress and appropriations associated with it. And I think that would continue into 27 in the out years. I think there's other elements of the overall posture built out across the INDOPACOM enterprise that will fall below the prioritization of the Guam defense system. But for the current fiscal year and the next fiscal year, I think we can say with authority that the unfunded line items are no longer on the table. Please.
Hafade. I'm Senator Hello Taidagui. I'm the Oversight Chair of the Military Buildup. First, I'd like to thank you so much, and everybody who spoke before you. Thank you so much for providing that transparency that the Admiral was mentioning earlier in his speech. And I also like to thank everyone who's here today to take the time out to understand what really is going on and having that information. So I greatly appreciate everyone being here. Outside the advances of the missile defense that we have been hearing today, I want to ask about the drone defense capabilities. As we know, China unveiled a slew of new weapons, which they paraded in their country, and many of them were drones. We have seen how many drones have been used in the warfare in Ukraine and the devastation that it has caused. We have seen how well drones have exploited missile defense systems, weaknesses in Israel, and how Israel used armed drones to track and target individuals and groups in Gaza. How well is the Department of War to address these and prepare Guam for the new aspect of warfare? Are there any immediate plans to develop and integrate drone defense into the EIMDS? And also, my second question would be, I noticed China has substantially increased satellite presence. How much growth in China has been made toward the fiber optic cable scenario?
Yeah, thank you. Hey, on the drone piece, great question, Senator, because it is a very contemporary part of the modern conflict, and to your absolute points, we've seen quite a lot of that in the Ukraine-Russia fight, as well as in Hamas and Israel. Here's what I would say about drones in the Pacific. Do they exist? Yes. Do the Chinese have them? Yes. Are they developing different types? Yes. But one thing is for sure right now with drones, especially when you get into the swarming drone world, they're smaller, therefore their range is shorter. And so the place where you would use these kind of small drones where having incredible effect, especially in the Ukraine, is when you're launching it from land and they're attacking something on land that's not too far away. And you can do that with hundreds and thousands of them in this kind of manifested way that has an immense effect on the forces that you're facing. In the Pacific Ocean area, it's quite far to fly a drone from mainland China towards, let's say, Guam. And that drone, if it was to be flown, would be the size of an airplane to carry the fuel it requires and so forth. Even our drones that we utilize in support of global operations, some of them are the size of airplanes, and to carry the munitions that are required and the fuel that's required to have that kind of longevity in flight. In terms of counter unmanned systems, those systems are in development by the Department of War. There are some that are actually fielded already. But I would tell you those get arrayed in the battle space based on the threat picture as analyzed by our intel analysts. And you could see a space in this theater where if we had fielded forces or naval forces operating very close to the mainland of China or other places of main Asia, you might see counter, unmanned system capabilities more prevalent. But the further you go out towards, the western coast of the United States, you would start to see a different way to defend against unmanned systems. In fact, the GDS type systems are some of the types of systems that would be utilized to defend against larger airframes as part of a more comprehensive defense package. In terms of the undersea cables or the fiber optics, that continues to be, I think, a place where we have a vulnerability. And I think some of our defense enterprises like the DISA team and others are looking to figure out how to harden critical infrastructure throughout the region so that we are more resilient in the event that crisis or conflict was to be on our horizon. Thanks.
If I could just
Operator,
add
sir.
for this, for Senator. Thank you so much. And just in the element of transparency, I mean, Amarpar did put an intelligence officer up here to talk to you today, so it's pretty transparent. What I would just add on to that regarding, and everything Colonel Lurie said is straight on when we talk about kind of drone capability, especially to get the distances that would need to get out to something like Guam. I just make sure to highlight overall where there are a lot of similarities and a lot of lessons learned that I think every military in the world is getting from the Russia-Ukraine conflict right now. There are some lessons and some tactics that do translate to a China-Taiwan fight and some that do not because of the differences in kind of capability and differences in the systems and differences in just the characteristics of the battlefield. As Colonel Lurie put, we would expect, drones will be probably a large part of, what would be an invasion force and kind of those types of operations towards Taiwan. As far as counter-intervention, the distances, as Colonel Lurie said, to get out to where they need to get to with those types of things, they have enough. We have said some of the numbers, the conventional forces they already have, just their missile systems, their extensive kind of range of aircraft, especially when you can refuel them, they can do a lot conventionally that they don't need drones for. And usually in those combat scenarios, we look at something like Ukraine, it's really that asymmetric capability that drones are good for, and something that China doesn't really need because they have that overwhelming match, especially against a force like Taiwan, which is much smaller.
And the reason why I bring this up is because the drones have been known to be able to go off of ships,
Yes.
in the thousands. So it's not the long range, it's the ships that's there. So we have to, and our missile defense system, this 360-degree defense system, it's fine for missiles, but as you know, drones are becoming a long way, as we're seeing every year growing, to avoid any type of tracking, radar tracking. So
Yes, ma'am.
I thank you so much for that. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Hey, Hafaday, sir. I got a question.
Yeah, one more.
We got one more, yep.
Hi, my name is Senator Will Parkinson. I'm a member of the 38th Guam Legislature, and I wanted to talk a little bit and ask a few questions about deterrence. Because, as an elected official out here, this is one of the few things that really keep me up at night is how could we assure deterrence for our island? Because I think that deterrence is going to be the #1 thing to not only keeping Guam safe, but also winning long-term against our enemies in the Pacific. Specifically, I'm looking at deterrence exercises like we've done where we had thousands of Air Force members from across the world come to Guam to have the largest military exercise we've ever had. And I imagine that's part of deterrence. And so I guess my question is, what other deterrence installations, practices do we have coming towards us to push that risk towards war further right? Because I do believe that there is a peaceful way to get out of this. There is a peaceful way to defeat our enemies. I think if we are able to deter this war long enough, that will lead to the aging out of some of their leadership. And not only that, the aging out of the fighting age of their soldiers, making them unable to wage war on us long term. And so, I mean, I guess my question is, how long do we have to string out this deterrence, and what other deterrence projects are we have to make it so that, you know, could we bring the Avengers of all our allies to Guam on 2027? Make sure that we don't get attacked, because I think that is the key to keeping Guam safe ultimately.
Yeah, thanks for that. So the quick answer, or a pithy answer, would be, we hear terms like peace through strength. So how do you get the strength? And the way I define that is, you got to establish some kind of framework to understand the comprehensive approach, or the whole government approach, to establish strength. And by strength, I mean resilience, in that it's a return on an investment type of equation. Do I want to attack a place that I'm going to have to expend an incredible amount of ordnance against, and effort against, and potentially lose capabilities against, when I'm not really going to hurt them that bad? And if that's the question, as a former commander, you know, then I might look elsewhere on the battlefield for another softer target. So how do we become stronger on Guam? We establish that framework, and we think through, what does that mean for the cyber domain? Are our cyber, you know, and our network capabilities fully hardened? Do we have, you know, the networks with the engineers associated with them, and have we kicked out, you know, belligerent players out of our networks, so that we know that we can have faith in our cyber and our network capabilities here on island? Is our air system here on the island, our air traffic controllers and our air defense capabilities and so forth, hardened, so that we know that it can't be penetrated and attacked, and if there is an attack, we can offset it with defensive measures? Our naval capabilities, is the port hardened? Do we know that the systems that run the port, have they been hardened so that they can't be infiltrated by a cyber attack and taken offline, so that we know our vessels can be safe and the economics continue to flow? Is our critical infrastructure, the roads, is it improved and safe, so that we can continue to move commodities back and forth between the airfield and the port? You know, so if you have a framework like that, and we work together between the government, local communities, capital investment, you know, private equity, you know, the whole package, that's how you harden and make a place resilient. And so that when an enemy targeteer is looking at it, they're like, well, let's not waste a bunch of missiles on that place, because we're just going to lose the missiles, because they're going to knock them out of the sky. Let's move on to somewhere that's less hard, is softer, and maybe a problem for them if we were to take them, you know, out of the fight altogether. So, you know, I think, you know, what we've presented and what we continue to highlight is that Homeland Defense is the #1 priority of the Department of War. It'll be the #1 priority in the forthcoming National Defense Strategy from Secretary Hegseth. And, you know, Guam is part of the homelands, and we must continue to enforce that methodology and work to enforce our force posture here in Guam and the other American territories and possessions in the Pacific, to ensure that we are as hard as possible, and we have set the conditions for any future crisis or contingency.
Okay,
And
so
I'd add that
just to be clear, so long-term demographic change and population collapse is part of our long-term strategy to defeat China.
That's right. I mean, you have to be
we know those challenges exist, and
Yeah.
and that's part of the issue, because deterrence takes on many forms, like, because we just talked about military deterrence, but also that, you know, allies and partners is a form of deterrence, showing to China that, hey, we are, you know, we have the you know, UK Prince of Wales coming out, and we have other ships coming out into the region. You have our Japanese partners or your Australian partners we exercise with regularly. That plays a part in deterrence. And yeah, the further you move that down, China has those economic, demographic, a lot of different challenges they're going to continue to face that'll make that calculation more difficult for them as they go forward. Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, no worries. I think that's all we have time for, right? Yeah. Hey, thanks so much. Look forward to engaging with you over the next couple of days.